first public frame of 3I/ATLAS looked like a smudge at the rim of Jupiter's aurora, a faint, diagonal brightness you could miss if you blinked. The second frame never left the secure network. In infrared, it was unmistakable, an asymmetric fan angling from the object, speckled with tiles that changed albedo like shutters. Not a coma, not a tail, a sail, and not passive. It modulated reflectivity across a lattice, trimming its own thrust. The thing wasn't falling, it was steering. Within 12 hours, the joint operations floor at Peterson reeked of coffee and warm electronics. A noisy crowd of uniforms and civilians patched together voice loops from JPL, Goddard, Vandenberg, Cape, and a hard line to the National Reconnaissance Office. On the main wall, the telemetry fed into a fat white curve sweeping in from the outer planets. Someone scrawled 3I/ATLAS over it and underlined it twice. A major crossed out the slash and rewrote it with a thinner line. It didn't matter. The name had stuck. Amy Rivers arrived with a backpack and a battered leather notebook. She was shorter than people expected and moved like someone who had spent years telling junior engineers to stop polishing and ship. Her clearance badge dangled against a University of Michigan lanyard so old the print had half peeled away. A colonel ushered her past a knot of staff toward a whiteboard that had already been sacrificed to quick math. "You're Rivers," he said, squinting at a tablet. "Dr. Rivers?" "Aerospace Systems. Orbital Dynamics," she corrected. "Systems when no one else wants it." He offered the dry, tired handshake of a man who'd been awake a day too long. "Colonel Avery." "You have the room." She uncapped a marker and wrote 2 numbers on the board with hard, square strokes. 19 seconds and 38,100 meters per second. Then she drew a thin rectangle and shaded it diagonally. "That's the window at perigee," she said. 19 seconds where relative geometry, atmosphere, and our vehicle velocities give us any non-zero kill probability. That's their ground relative speed through that slot. Silence pinned the room for a beat. The only sound was the cooling fan on a servo cart rasping out a little dust. "We don't get a second lap?" asked a captain from the back, already knowing the answer. "They'll be on a very tall ellipse after the skim," Amy said. "Apogee out past geosynchronous. Different game up there. Longer timelines, smaller targets, more places to hide. We need to hurt them on the first pass or we're in attrition without leverage." Colonel Avery gestured at the sail on the thermal feed, its tiles flickering between bright and black. "Could we throw mass at it earlier? Push debris into the lane? Nets? Cables? We don't control enough mass that far out," Amy said. "And they do." Look, she tapped a graph on the secondary monitor, a sequence of microburns that looked like static. "They're bleeding delta V like a miser, exactly as if they've done this before." "Assume intelligence," Avery said. "Everyone comfortable with that?" Nods. No one in the room wanted to be the one to bet on luck. The plan grew the way good plans do when there isn't time to fall in love with cleverness. 3 nuclear interceptors on 3 different boosters, 2 from Vandenberg, 1 from Canaveral, climbing into a coplanar corridor the analysts were beginning to call the slot. Each interceptor was a bus, propellant tankage, reaction wheels, RCS thrusters, a narrow-beam X-band radar, a cooled shortwave IR seeker with a small field of view, a quick hardening ablative nose cone, and a final package, a kinetic forebody coupled to a variable yield device with an X-ray dominant output profile. "The nuke isn't for a fireball," Amy said. anticipating the question. At that altitude, most of the prompt will dump outward. We want to throw a dense shell of photons and neutrons across their trajectory and cook critical electronics, compromise structures, generate spall and thermal shock. The kinetic forebody goes in first to blind or gouge sensors and soften whatever is forward-facing. A systems engineer raised a hand. We have yield authority? Conditionally, Avery said, if you tell me there's no other way. There isn't, Amy said. Not at 38 kilometers per second. Constraints stacked like bricks. GPS wouldn't be reliable when the ionosphere was bucking. Geomagnetic indices were already trending ugly, and if the ship could influence solar wind coupling, the sky would be full of scintillation. Uplink commands would struggle through noise and delay. Any human call would be late and likely wrong. On the tracking floor, a radar lead showed the smear from the first Jupiter assist pass and tried not to sound impressed. We go autonomous, Amy said. No human in the loop once they're out of the atmosphere. Avery turned his head, slow. You're asking me to authorize 3 live nuclear devices that will, after a point, make their own decisions. I'm telling you, physics cut the loop before we got here, she said. We cannot measure, think, decide, and transmit inside a 19th of a minute through a charged sky against an adversary that can change cross-section mid-flight. We bind decision trees to time and star tracker clocks. We pre-compute branch weights, and we let the code do what we brought it here to do. The room didn't breathe for a second. The legal advisor at the far table scribbled something and slid it to a general who read it and didn't react. Show me the trees, Avery said. Guidance filled the big screen with a schematic that looked, to an untrained eye, like a subway map drawn by a composer. Nodes labeled with states, A12, B3, C7, arrows branching based on conditions. IR centroid divergence less than epsilon, radar return Blumen greater than beta, time to go minus clock bias less than tau. Each leaf ended in a directive. Commit, slew, wait, D-D. They had argued for 6 hours the night before about whether to allow DUD as a terminal state. Amy had kept it in. A nuke fired into an empty sky is worse than a weapon not fired at all. She flipped to error budgets. Uncertainty in relative position and velocity from ground radar plus integrated IMU drift gives us an ellipse we can live with if the atmosphere behaves. The atmosphere may not behave. We bought nose cones and margins where we could. The software will trust kinematics over brightness, mass, not shine. If they throw decoys, we don't chase the loudest lie. What if they throw a lot? Someone asked. Then we see what breaks first, their ability to saturate or our ability to reject. By evening, the whiteboard had become a layered palimpsest of arcs and numbers. The logistics officer from Vandenberg dialed in from a hangar where technicians in ear protection were riveting fairings. The voice loop crackled. He shouted above a whine. Interceptors 1 and 2 buttoning up. Fueling and ordnance begin at 0300. Weather marginal but green. Range clear. Canaveral came up an hour later. 3 is on track, but we're bumping into a launch window for a commercial ComSat. Move the ComSat, Avery said without asking anyone. Roger, moving the ComSat. Amy walked the hangar catwalk at Vandenberg at 0310Z, watching crews slide a composite shroud into place over Interceptor 1. It didn't look like salvation. It looked like a glossy cylinder with flight heritage. A technician looked up, saw the badge on her chest, and lifted a thumb without stopping what he was doing. She lifted hers in return. On the floor nearby, a stack of hard cases weighted with Star Tracker. Do not drop, stenciled on the lids. Someone had taped a photo to one of them, a Polaroid of a beach at dusk with 3 kids building a crooked tower out of wet sand. The caption read, in Sharpie, "Keep it up." She found a quiet corner between a jetway and a support strut and called the dry, high-altitude number she still thought of as home. It rang twice and went to a voice she loved like a good theorem. "I won't be home for a while," she said. "Don't wait up. Eat." "The usual. We'll keep a plate," the voice said. "You sound awake." "I am," she lied. Back on the floor, she killed a proposal to add a last-minute uplink ping at T-minus 60 seconds, just to confirm health. "We can't afford the temptation," she said. "Every second of uplink adds uncertainty in the loop. We can't be the reason the clock slips. People will want to know," the comms lead said, tired and reasonable. "They'll know," Amy said, and wrote down a line in her notebook she didn't want to forget. Ignorance by choice is not ignorance. She drew a box around it and underlined it twice. As dawn bled in at the edges of the blackout shades, the room's chatter slowed from frantic to precise. The models had converged as much as they were going to. Atlas had completed its long, cold kiss with Jupiter, and now rode the inbound leg with the sail extended wider than any human structure had ever been. The lattice tiles flickered in patterns no one could decode in real time. When the NRO analyst presented a frame sequence that showed a barely perceptible ripple move across the sail and vanish, Amy made herself put the printout down instead of staring at it until it gave up a secret it might not hold. A young engineer with a buzz cut and a nervous habit of tugging his left sleeve cornered her at the coffee urn. "Dr. Rivers, if their sail is truly active, can they generate lift orthogonal to the sunlight vector enough to trim, yes, enough to jump out of the slot?" Number. The slot is our construction, not theirs. It's where the sky and their velocity and our reach overlap. They don't have to jump out to hurt us. They just have to make the slot ambiguous. He swallowed. "What if we're modeling the wrong thing?" "We are," she said. "Always. That's why we bound the wrongness and buy robustness instead of accuracy for its own sake. Don't fall in love with precise lies." He nodded, like a student being handed both mercy and a warning. At 0600Z, the weather desk reported a KP index rising faster than forecast. A pale green bruise of aurora slid down Canada and toward the Dakotas. The ionosphere would be writhing when the interceptors needed star fixes most. The room felt it without anyone saying it out loud. The skies were not neutral. An hour later, they pushed go, Vandenberg's pre-dawn gloom shredded under a blade of white flame. The first booster climbed clean and drifted east to ride a shallow dogleg over the Pacific. 10 minutes later, with Florida already damp and bright, the second booster grabbed the sky from Canaveral and pushed hard into a blue that looked almost indifferent. A third followed Vandenberg's path, engines sketching a brief paragraph on the morning. Ascent voice loops became staging loops, became fairing jettison calls. Then the sound died, and in its place came numbers and little colored vectors crawling across maps. The buses separated as planned. Small course corrections stitched them into the corridor. Ground radar updated the filter banks. The guidance software settled into the hum you only felt if you had written such software yourself. A pressure behind the eyes, the sense of something tidy clicking forward. Avery slid down from the mezzanine and stood a step behind Amy's right shoulder, hands behind his back, eyes on the wall. "If this works," he said softly, "does it change the war?" "It changes the day," she said. "The war will be the orbit after this one." He let that sit. Last chance to put a human in the loop, even a veto. She didn't look at him. The maps held her. The math held her. We'd be decorating the plan with comfort. "We need speed, not comfort. Copy," he said, and meant it. They had done what they could do. The slot hung in the upper air over the Pacific like a chalked line no one on the ground would ever see. 3 buses flew toward it with their clocks already committed to futures they could only approximate. Amy closed her notebook and placed her palm flat on it as if pinning a gecko. If she pressed hard enough, the pages felt like they might fuse into one sheet. "Clear the air," she said to no one in particular. "Everyone who doesn't have a console, step back. If you have a console, breathe." We're inside final approach, a murmur of fabric and chair feet on tile, and then the kind of quiet that happens in operating rooms and launch control and jury rooms when the thing that has been riding toward you for hours finally clears the horizon. On the big screen, the velocity vector lengthened. On another, a thin, almost funny rectangle represented the 19 seconds. A technician adjusted his headset and stopped fidgeting. A lawyer folded her hands and stared at the tabletop. Atlas crossed lunar distance, then half that. Tiny corrections like taps from a finger appeared in the Doppler stream. The sail brightened, darkened, brightened again as if it were breathing. A radar tech called out a small, non-coherent echo with too much confidence for debris. Amy wrote nothing. She had promised herself she wouldn't write during the window. Superstition, but also discipline. Watch, don't narrate. The clock ticked toward the slot, and there was nothing left to do. The room had the weight of a loaded spring held by a thumbnail. Amy found herself counting her breaths in 8s, as if she could pace the sky. 19 seconds isn't much in a life. It's an era in guidance. "State A, 17, a console murmured. "Transition to B3. "B3, another confirmed. "B3, a third echoed, and somewhere in Florida, a seagull tilted over warm water and did not care that the species that had invented the word perigee had put 3 tiny machines on an intersect that might or might not define the next century. Amy didn't glance at the clock. The slot had already begun. They launched at the edges of the continent because the sky meets the sea there, and it's easier to pretend the world is flat. Vandenberg's pre-dawn gave up the first fire, a knife of white that lifted slow and then climbed with purpose until it looked like a pinhole eating its way through night. 10 minutes later, Canaveral let go of a second, and the Cape swamp light turned gold as if the day had been miscolored. A third rose out of California, trailing a paragraph of contrail that Wind pulled into cursive. The feeds went quiet when the fairing split. Cameras are heavy and secrets are brittle. Inside the joint floor at Peterson, the talking stopped because nothing left to decide is a kind of silence. A strip of paper taped to the main console said, "Don't touch the clock." No one had ever touched the clock, but someone had needed to say it. The radar plots refreshed with a rhythm that could have been music if you were tired enough. A sweep, a smear, a dot that resolved into a vector. Star Tracker solutions rolled in as tight quaternions and were converted to the kind of arrows that calm kernels. Above the status lines, a thin rectangle marked space where there would be no forgiveness. 19 seconds. The slot. Amy read the consoles without moving her lips, the way you do when you've lived with abstractions so long they're furniture. Interceptor 1 separated, coasted, coughed one planned correction burn. 2 did the same. 3 trimmed a fraction more to hit a clock time it was already loyal to. The buses settled onto rails they couldn't feel, carrying seekers they hadn't yet awakened. The room had the brittle quiet of a surgical theater just before the first incision. Everything clean, everything inevitable. Telemetry from deep space came in staccato bursts, and the comms techs crushed noise for a living. On one channel, a Vandenberg prop guy reported that the hangar had returned to smelling like solvent and hot plastic. On another, a range officer in Florida joked that his fishermen were finally getting some sleep. Both channels were cut by order, and not unkindly. The loops narrowed to guidance, radar, weather. At the far end of the floor, a legal advisor leaned over a notebook and wrote something in looping script. All Amy could read upside down was the word authority, underlined twice. The sky misbehaved on cue. KP climbed, auroral line sagged south like tired drapery, and the ionosphere began to glitter. Scintillation tore at GPS from the side like a dog with a toy. The NRO liaison cleared his throat as he flagged a frame sequence no one had asked for. A slow ripple crossing the sail that wasn't light and wasn't shadow, more like a change in the way the sail decided to be seen. Amy watched the sequence once and set it down. If she'd let it live under her eyelids, she'd start seeing patterns inside the patterns. She had work to do that didn't require awe. Avery drifted down from the mezzanine and stood at her shoulder, hands linked behind his back, the habit of a man who preferred to hold something but wouldn't. If we get nothing, we say we fired, he said, not quite asking. If we get nothing, Amy said, we say we were within the physics and outside their degrees of freedom. Then we move to ground defense and pretend time is generous. He nodded, watching the clock because he had told himself he wouldn't. Last call. Any human veto in the loop, even a dead man's switch. She didn't turn. Colonel, if I give them a veto, someone will use it 1 second too late to save a life and 2 seconds too early to save the mission. The code is the only thing that doesn't panic. He made a sound that could have been assent or grief and stepped back 1 pace as if giving the window room. The interceptor seekers came cold and hungry onto their rails. Their radars pinged in tight, stingy beams. Not because energy was scarce, energy was cheap, time was not, but because wide cones invite error. Kinematic filters spun up, lit with priors that said, big things move like big things, and bright things lie. Guidance scrolled its internal subway map. A 17 to B3 if centroid divergence less than epsilon, B3 to C2 if bloom exceeds beta and time to go, minus bias to less than tau. The paths were simple by design. Complexity breeds latency, and latency is death. Crossing 200,000, a console whispered, voice unconsciously reverent. The numbers never care, but people do. Amy took her hand off her notebook because she had realized she'd been pinning it to the table. She matched her breathing to nothing at all. If you give your body a rhythm, it will go find ritual inside it, and you'll miss what matters. A smudge appeared on radar that didn't fit debris models. Too coherent, too disciplined. The IR feed showed the sail, not brighter, not darker, just other, a selection of emissivity frames that traveled across its face like thought. Someone at the back said, there, and someone at the front said, quiet. And the room managed to become even more still. The first sign of the countermeasure was generous. You could have called it a gift if you didn't know better. The radar returned a snow of points, non-coherent centimeter-scale dipoles sprinting across the slot at comparable velocity. The software, trained to ignore brightness, did not flinch. On its internal canvas, the forest of needles barely altered the line that mattered, the vector that a mass the size of a city and the temperament of a machine would carve through 19 seconds of our air. Interceptor 1's filter rejected, and then because we strip heuristics down for speed, accepted. Amy read the branch as it flipped, B3 to D1. Commit. The bus kicked the kinetic four-body free. A small motor lit, and the four-body leaped ahead into plasma that drew lines across its skin. The device behind it spun its internal dials toward arm. In the corner of the IR frame, something changed that no one noticed in real time. A shadow that was not a shadow moved deeper into the slot, away from the bright specks tumbling. The four-body crossed the point where you would have sworn the target had to be. The device bloomed, per timing, into a pulse the atmosphere barely tasted. A hollow sphere of energy opened its hands and found only glitter. The dipoles fell in a brief, pretty line, like the end of some celebration not meant for us. Telemetry, Avery said with a professional calm so smooth it had to be carved. Damage? Negative on main, a voice replied. No change in mass estimate within uncertainty. No measurable perturbation beyond model. The room didn't crack. It shrank by an inch in every direction. Interceptor 1's channel went to a low, obedient thrum that meant it was done. 2 kept its head. The dipole haze thickened. Frost on a windshield. The IR seeker narrowed its field by a few degrees per plan and starved itself of distraction. The radar ignored the forest and listened for the trunk. Kinematics pulled one faint line out of the noise. Not the loudest, not the prettiest, just the one that moved like 80,000 tons with a sail worth a county. State B3 persisted. B3 persisted. Commit. 2 has committed, guidance called, purely declarative. The four-body went forward, pulling a thread of light through air that hates intruders. The device behind it counted down in internal language and, at 0, wrote a hard syllable no human throat can form. On the main map, the model of Atlas staggered, not because it was real time, but because the residuals had to draw themselves somewhere. IR showed a brief torch shedding off the main body, a hot, angular shape spinning, cooling, going to night. Hit, someone breathed. Ancillary, Amy said, not unkindly. A bus, maybe a sensor boom. The spine holds. She could feel the room wanting to take Joy and knew better. Joy bends judgment, and they had one bus left with one geometry left inside one slice of time. The last counter was elegant and petty at once. In the final seconds, the sail did something the models had not been allowed to know it could do. It folded a long, thin strip along its axis and snapped the fold shut. Cross-section fell. Yaw changed. Thermal signature shifted like a disguise put on mid-stride. Interceptor 3's tree, which had been thinned to keep from thinking too long, read 3 changes as one truth it recognized. The primary had become the spur. A typical transient, guidance warned, fingers already off the keyboard because there was nothing to type. 3's Seeker snapped to a secondary, a glinting stalk slave to the main body like a remora to a shark. Commit. The foreboding flew true. The device waited its scant eternity and blossomed where the stalk had been. For 2 frames, Pieces of it sparkled like ground glass in the sunlight. Then they were gone. The main body did not wobble. It did not flare. It did not congratulate us for our accuracy. It met the slot, kept its appointment, and left. 19 seconds ended the way doors close in old houses, with a sound you only hear if you've lived there long enough. The consoles returned to their ordinary hum. The Aurora peeled back a little as if embarrassed about being a witness. Somewhere in Florida, a pelican floated on flat water and blinked. "Status," Avery said, eyes still on the board, because there is nowhere else to look when the thing that matters is invisible. "Thermal indicates venting from one location," the analyst said. "Likely ancillary module loss. No sustained overheating. Dynamics within predicted band given mass ratio. Computing post-perigee state vector." Amy knew the shape before the line rendered. You could taste ellipses if you had done enough of them. A low kiss and a long reach. An apogee that would squat high over the poles, and a perigee that would knuckle back across the continents like habit. The white arc drew itself on the wall, a new orbit that would give the ship long looks and short strikes. She waited for her body to invent an emotion and chose none. The room didn't exhale. Exhalation would concede something, and there was still work in the air. Guidance read the numbers. Primary has inserted into a highly elliptical Earth orbit. Period 6 hours, 13 minutes. Perigee approximately 1,300 kilometers. Apogee over 60,000. Inclinations retrograde relative to populated mid-latitudes. Phasing will bring next perigee over the Pacific day side in... "Stop," Avery said, not angrily. "We'll brief on the quarter hour." On a side screen, the residual plots that had been Amy's heartbeat flattened into something polite. She let herself touch her notebook again, not to write, but to confirm it was still there, that something small had remained where she'd left it. Across the floor, someone took off a headset and set it down with two hands like a crown that did not fit. "Interceptor status?" she asked. "Business, because there was only that." "1 is spent," came the reply. "2's bus is functional but mission complete. 3 is dark. All destruct permissions cleared by expiry. No unauthorized anomalies." "Copy," she said. She looked at the board where 100 thin labels meant people. "Any ground effects from the bursts?" "Negative," Environmental answered. "All detonation altitudes outside atmospheric coupling thresholds. No immediate ionization spikes beyond background variation. Good, bad. None of it mattered in the way she wanted, which was total." Avery stood still for 3 long breaths, then turned so his voice would carry without shouting. "We transition to post-perigee posture. Plan Delta, move power priority to hospitals, water plants, comms nodes. NORAD, to distribute remaining interceptors to city rings per pre-plan. State, to coordinate National Guard readiness. Comms, prepare a statement for the interagency. No attribution, no operational detail, just that the perigee intercept was executed." "Yes, sir," the room said in the plural. Amy didn't volunteer a line. That would be later, and not here. Here, she let the failure be exactly the size it was. Not total, not trivial, not noble, not shameful. Merely a collision between what could be decided at human speed and what could be altered at machine speed with a broader palette. She kept her eyes on the ellipse, which looked clean and unthreatening in white. It was not unthreatening. It was a metronome you could set your fear to. A soft chime marked the end of a logging segment and the start of another. People stood, stretched, sat again, some abandoning chairs for floors because floors don't move. The weather desk posted an update about mid-latitude aurora. The NRO man, polite to a fault, asked if anyone wanted to see the sail ripple sequence again. No one answered, and he put the printouts face down as if they were indecent. Amy stepped to the rail and looked down at the boards a level below, where younger engineers were already running variants they wouldn't get to fly. She felt a brief, irrational anger at their diligence. How quickly we pivot to next when now has just broken. And then the anger dissolved because what else is there? She put her hand flat on the metal, cool and honest. You tell the structure what you need from it, and it either holds or it doesn't. Today, the sky had held for the wrong side. "Dr. Rivers," a comms officer called softly. "Interagency in 15. They'll ask you to speak." "Understood," she said. She looked at the 19-second rectangle on the wall, now gray and meaningless, and thought of how civilized it had seemed to give catastrophe a box to live in. Outside the building, the Colorado morning was thin and bright, and no one on the base who didn't have a reason to know would know that above their heads a new line had been drawn that would cross them like weather. She closed the notebook without writing in it and walked toward the door. Behind her, the floor kept working, a machine with too much heart and not enough time, and above all of it, a vehicle with a sail like a continent coasted into an ellipse it had chosen, carrying inside itself variables Amy had not been allowed to imagine without lying to the math. The loop stayed silent by design. That was the victory they had. It didn't feel like one. They called it a debrief, but it felt like a room where the air had been vacuumed out and replaced with etiquette. The same flags, the same hum, the same stink of coffee and cold plastic. Only now the faces had that post-impact stillness that makes even blinking sound loud. On the wall, the new orbit drew itself with a neat white ellipse, a polite arc that might as well have been a noose. Amy stood at the lectern with her leather notebook open to a page that read Delta Freedom in block letters. The ink had dug so hard it left impressions on the page beneath. "We did not miscalculate," she said, no preamble. She had learned that beginnings wasted on the wrong sentence make people stop listening. Our geometry was right. Our clocks were right. The error budgets were honest. We lost because they changed more variables faster than we can sense and decide. She tapped the white line on the screen with the cap of her marker. They controlled cross-section, emissivity, internal mass distribution, attitude, decoy density, and the signal environment in under 4 seconds at perigee. We bound ourselves to a narrow window and asked our machines to decide inside it. They stepped sideways out of our assumptions and walked through. No one asked a question. What would you ask? The weather to go back. A captain in the 3rd row had a pen in his hand he wasn't using. He kept turning it between his fingers like a fine rod he was trying not to break. Colonel Avery stood with his hands behind his back, his uniform suddenly too formal for a room whose future had gone casual. "Bottom line," he said softly, "they're in a high elliptical orbit, intact enough to deploy," Amy said. "They will take timing, power, navigation, then they will use kinetics to shape behavior. We go to Plan Delta. We decentralize, we simplify, we buy hours with gasoline and paper and line of sight, and we accept that hours are the unit we're allowed." A comms officer slid into the back, cheeks wind-burned from a jog to the relay van. "NORAD has new objects on the ascending leg," he said, Small, high aspect, solar arrays holding steady at 60 to 80,000 feet over the Pacific track. Likely station keepers' pseudo-lights, Amy said. Local references for corrections and bullhorns for whatever comes next. Then Delta, Avery said. He didn't raise his voice. He never had to. Power triage to hospitals, water, comms. Remaining interceptors to city rings per pre-plan. Stake guard on distributed comms. Comms. Craft a statement for the interagency. Execute it as planned. No operational details. Hold hyperbole. Legal. Draft the authorizations for dual-use requisition. They move through it the way you move through a liturgy you've rehearsed and hoped never to say out loud. Assignments fell into hands. Runners traded badges for messenger bags. The generator desk posted a table of diesel consumption rates that made the room wince in a purely professional way. Solutions built themselves out of grit and compromise because that's what human beings do when they can't fix the math. On the far wall, a muted TV continued to insist on its version of reality. An anchor in a tasteful suit. A strip of words at the bottom that said coastal power outages. A window behind her showing a slice of sky and ocean that looked like a screensaver. The picture fluttered every few seconds and then steadied, like a heartbeat that hadn't decided whether to stay regular. Interagency in 10, someone told Amy. They'll want you. She nodded, uncapped the marker, and wrote on the edge of the board. We calculated correctly. They had more degrees of freedom. She didn't plan to read it. She wrote it because a sentence you can point to will keep you from making a worse one in the moment. In the hallway, the air was colder. A vending machine hummed like a contented cat. Amy found a phone with a dial tone on the second ring and called the number in Colorado that still answered without a robot. Hey, the voice said. I won't be home, she said. I don't know for how long. If anyone comes to the door with a badge, make them read the name twice. We'll wait, the voice said, reflex and love. Don't, she said, surprising herself. Go to Mary's place in town. If the lights go, fill the tub. If the phones go, go to the fire station. If the gas goes, leave the house. Don't argue with the sky. A silence that wasn't empty. All right, the voice said. I'll bring the old radio. It's a good one, she said. It likes noise. She stayed on the line a second too long and then hung up before she said anything she couldn't work afterward. Back in the room, the interagency call was already stitched together. Defense, energy, homeland, agriculture, FCC, EPA, DHS. The alphabet that comes out when the world won't behave. Amy stood in front of a camera with a red light that made her teeth look too white in the preview and waited for the polite cascade of, "Can you hear me?" to die. Dr. Rivers, a voice said from a pain-labeled state. Did the intercept fail? We executed the plan within the physics we had, she said. We imposed a cost. It wasn't decisive. Do we have a risk to civilians from the detonations? No, Amy said. Detonation altitudes were above atmospheric coupling thresholds. No fallout, no prompt effects on the ground. What happens now? Another voice asked. This one from energy, flat with stress. They will start by removing what makes us fast and coordinated, Amy said. Grid nodes, switching yards, navigation. They will probably avoid big photogenic craters because those galvanize. Expect surgical inconveniences that become surgical catastrophes. Is there anything the public should do? Homeland asked. Think analog, Amy said. Cash, paper, fuel, water, local nets. Know where your neighbors are. If someone tells you the sky is screaming, look up yourself before you move. Can we say we damaged the ship? The press liaison asked, already writing the sentence she wanted. We can say we changed a parameter, Amy said. Please don't sell hope that isn't edible. When the call ended, her legs felt like someone had replaced the muscles with tight wire. She stood still until the wire stopped humming, then went looking for something that required hands. The generator tech let her help swing a flywheel on a portable unit. It coughed, caught, and settled into the human sound of trying. At local noon, the first pass of the new orbit sunk over the west coast like a polite appointment kept on time. There was no siren because no one had designed a siren for rods that fall at several kilometers a second under a sky that has forgotten your name. The first impacts were not the landmarks, they were the connective tissue. 2 substations in San Jose, a switching yard north of Los Angeles, a pair of high-tension spans where the lines jump a canyon like a dare. In each place, a silver blur, a small sound, a large silence. Lights that had thought of themselves as permanent remembered they were rented. Hospitals went to generator. Water pressure sighed into gravity and then lower. Traffic lights gave up dignity first and then order. You could hear the compression of civilization, the way a city shrinks to the distance your voice carries. On the base, one of the feeds threw up a live shot from a Portland dispatch center. The camera caught 3 operators talking into handsets, while the room behind them went dark like a reverse sunrise. An operator lifted a flashlight and kept talking, as if the light had always been in her hand. She said, "Copy," as if copy was still a word that meant anything. Pseudo-lights are adjusting, the NORAD liaison called. We have a cluster holding over the Central Valley, another tracking over Puget Sound. They're not doing anything yet. They're just there. They don't have to do anything yet, Amy said. They're increasing their degrees of freedom. Avery gave her a look that was almost a smile and not at all amused. You're going to make that our epitaph. No, she said. I'm making it our diagnosis. Epitaphs are for after the second wave came in patterns you could miss if you didn't know where to feel for them. Not dams, spillways, not airports, fuel farms, not ports, cranes. The rods were precise and rude, the way a surgeon is rude when she saves a life and cuts the thing you liked about your body. The grid map on the wall lost big chunks like teeth, then lots of little ones like plaque scraped away by a meticulous hand. The room's generator hiccuped and recovered. A coffee machine somewhere tried to start and then remembered it was a luxury. Gale force gusts in the upper Midwest, the weather desk called. Ionosphere unstable. Expect HF to degrade unevenly. Uneven is fine, Amy said. Uneven, we can ride. She took the call from a State Guard colonel in Kansas who wanted to know whether to hold fuel for moving dialysis patients or pushing patrols. Patients, she said. Patrols can walk. She said it with a steadiness she didn't feel and hung up into a pocket of silence she'd been making for herself between tasks. Her notebook lay open on the console. She looked at the words she had written earlier and felt sudden, disloyal fury at their neatness. The sentence sat there so composed, so satisfied with its balance. She wanted to rip the page out and eat it. Instead, she drew a box around it and shaded the box in, dark enough to make the paper almost tear. Inside the box, the letters still showed through. Dr. Rivers, a young analyst said gently from her left. We have an anomaly in the Rockies. A cascade of student radio nets just came up, unlicensed. They're relaying EMS calls. Capture the frequencies and give them to local, she said. Don't shut them down. Not today. She looked at the kid. He couldn't have been out of school more than 2 years. His badge hung crooked. And make a note of the call signs. Someday we'll buy them pizza. He nodded, cheeks flushing in a way that made him look even younger. An hour later, the first of the stratospheric station keepers over the plains began transmitting a simple tone on and off. Nothing sinister, just the insistence of presence. A metronome the human ear couldn't hear, but human systems could. A ground-based GPS spoofing alert tripped and kept tripping, the map of little green triangles that meant we know where we are pulsed in and out like a bad thought. Go to paper, Avery said to the room without moving his head. Anything you can do with a pencil, do with a pencil. Anything you can carry on foot, carry on foot. If you can't explain a system to a firefighter in 1 minute, it's the wrong system. People smiled, a quick, mean smile that meant thank you for telling us what we already knew, but needed to hear again. They held the base like that, on pencils and boots, and a generator that shook the floor with honest effort. The sky stayed ruthlessly beautiful. The ellipse completed its first long reach to apogee and began to fall back. Someone on the mezzanine started to say, we should get a break before the next pass, and caught himself because the room had no use for lies, even if they would have been kindly. In a quiet minute that wasn't quiet at all, Amy stood at the far end of the wall and looked up at the white arc. If she relaxed her eyes, she could see every ellipse she had ever drawn in a classroom and everyone she had ever thrown away, because a student needed something more than true. She had wanted to be a person who built vehicles for going to interesting places slowly and coming back changed. Instead, she was a person who had designed a 19-second ambush that failed because the other side had a better grasp of the knobs. You going to sleep? Avery asked, like a joke that knows it isn't one. Not while the clocks run, she said. He hesitated, then let the rank fall away long enough to offer his hand. She took it. His palm was warm and dry and wholly human. It grounded her in a way the map never could. They'll want a line, he said, for the call with the governors. They're asking for something that lets them tell people the truth without collapsing the truth on them. She looked at her shaded box, the sentence still legible under graphite. She could give them metaphors and they would taste like surrender. She could give them numbers and they would taste like evasion. She could give them the one thing she had that had not lied to her all morning. Tell them this, she said. We calculated correctly. They had more degrees of freedom. She let the words settle, felt their weight. Tell them to make theirs bigger, not by believing, by doing, lines of sight, local power. Resist the urge to wait for permission. There won't be any, I can work with that, he said. And for the first time in hours, his mouth remembered how to soften. The generator sputtered, coughed, and steadied. In the corner, the TV lost the anchor and kept the window. Sky and a strip of ocean too bright, as if the exposure had slipped. Above that sky, invisible to every eye in the room, the sail that had once looked like a mistake to amateurs trimmed itself for the second low pass. Somewhere, another set of rods waited in neat stacks for gravity to do the expensive part. Amy capped the marker and set it on the console with the care you give a blade you've finished with. She wrote 2 numbers under the shaded box. T plus 00, and beside it, a sideways 8 that wasn't quite a joke. She put the notebook in her bag because there are things you carry even when your hands should be empty. The room changed shape around her as people left for alternates and others arrived with new maps printed on paper that still smelled like warm toner. The world was already smaller, shrunk to what you could reach without asking, to stairwells, to hallways, to a road to town where the traffic lights were out, and the rule of the road had reverted to eye contact and kindness. "Dr. Rivers," the young analyst said again, hesitant, "when this is over—" "It won't be," she said, and surprised herself by how little cruelty there was in it. "But we'll run out of this kind of day." They always end. He swallowed and nodded, because endings are the one thing we know how to plan for. Outside, the sun did its ordinary work on the asphalt. The base smelled like cut grass and hot metal. A bird stitched a line across the sky with no knowledge of vectors or windows. The metronome of the orbit ticked toward the next beat. There were still systems to simplify, fuel to move, frequencies to write on white tape and slap on radios, people to tell the same sentence to until it fit in their mouths. Amy squared the pages in her bag and stepped back to her console. The map's white ellipse crossed the blue of the projection, smooth and clean. You could almost pretend it was a path to somewhere worth going. She didn't pretend. She put her finger on the part of the line where the sky bows down and becomes hot and friendless, and said quietly to no one, "Here." When the first rods of the second pass fell, the sound came late, as always, as if the air had to decide whether to tell on what had been done to it. The room didn't flinch. It moved, it called, it wrote, it wound little handles on little generators. It held. We had calculated correctly. They had more degrees of freedom. The difference between those statements and fate was work, and there was still some left.